Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's Politalk lecture. But before we begin, we want to acknowledge that UFV is situated in the traditional Solo territories. And here in Abbotsford, I would like to acknowledge particularly the Sumas, the Musqueam, and Kwantlen First Nations, our closest neighbors. My name is Edward Akufo, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and also the head of department. And I'll be your moderator this afternoon for this Politalk event. Now, Politalk Roundtable Series and Lecture is a platform for engaging on topical issues. Here at Politalk, we push the boundaries of ideas, creating public awareness, and sustaining active minds that are conscious of political, cultural, and socio-economic issues in our community and at the world at large. Today, we have the privilege to learn about hybrid warfare, an issue that is so burning in the news and in the military headquarters around the world. We hope that you'll be engaged and that you'll also be challenged this afternoon to think deeply about this particular threat against Canada and Canadian society, including all of us here. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I would like to acknowledge the presence of the Dean of the College of Arts, Dr. Sylvie Murray, and the Associate Dean of Faculty, Dr. Tetsiomi Anzai, and also Dr. Scott Sheffield, and as well as faculty from the Department of Political Science, Dr. Simon Lambeck, Dr. Jessica Price, and Dr. Noah Schwartz. And I also would like to acknowledge our very hardworking department coordinator, Natasha Tivet. Please, let's give her a round of applause. She's working so hard to Natasha, we really and truly are very appreciative of every effort that you make, to make these events, come online. Now, we move on to introduce our speaker. Our speaker this afternoon is Andrea Lane, who is a defense scientist at the Defense Research and Development Canada. She specializes on Canadian military culture and structures, as well as personnel management. As a strategic analyst with the Department of National Defense, Andrea's personal research focuses on the intersection of national defense politics and society, examining the military as an institution, civil military relations, personnel policy, and procurement. Andrea's work has been published in the International Journal, Canadian Foreign Policy Journal, and the Canadian Naval Review, and has chapters in several books and in popular venues such as Policy Options. She is a co-editor with Brian Bowe of Canadian Foreign Policy, Reflections on a Field in Transition, which was published by UBC Press in 2020. As a defense scientist, she works with the Maritime Operations Research Team, and which is based in Esquimalt, British Columbia, as a strategic analyst supporting the Royal Canadian Navy. She was an assistant professor at the Canadian Forces College, a deputy director at the Center for the Study of Security, and was a lecturer at Dalhousie University. Please, let's welcome Andrea to the podium with a round of applause.
Thank you for that introduction. I should explain that hardly anything in that bio is actually relevant anymore. And that's because my LinkedIn is reflecting the fact that I recently gave up on my PhD. So like my research profile is the stuff I did when I was a PhD student. And now I do this as my day job. So it's not that it's not who I am or have I been, but I don't do a lot that has to do with personnel currently. For the military, the research that I do is looking more like the future threat environment and that kind of thing. So here is my fancy slide deck. The title of my talk is only sort of relevant to what I'm going to be talking to. DRDC, most of my colleagues are what I would call real scientists. And so they do the kind of work that you see on this slide deck. And there's a real push to have us be a part of the defense team. So we have this defense team branding, which is totally irrelevant to the work that I do. But here it is. I'm obliged to show it to you. So the lecture outline today, you'll see there is something a little bit about threats. But again, you're going to find me going down a bunch of rabbit holes that have nothing to do with information warfare as we like to frame it. So I'm going to start with who I am and why that matters. And then I'll move on to a little bit about terminology, the way that I use it, the threat, if we can call it that, the way that international adversaries interact with our domestic politics, a little bit about how the information environment affects the people that I work with, which is the Canadian Armed Forces, and then what you can do to help, but not in like a weird way in which I recruit you to be spies or information warriors, just some things that we all as Canadians can think about on the way to making ourselves less vulnerable, I guess would be the way to talk about it. So the reason that I want to tell you a little bit about myself is because I really think that it matters, not just the messenger, or not just the message, but also the messenger. And so when you hear me speak, obviously, because I'm up here and I have a clicker, you're going to take me seriously. But I want you to think about how these factors and my place of employment, who I am as a person and my educational background, how those might affect the information that I'm giving you. Because I am absolutely not giving you the Government of Canada official statement on information warfare. I'm not giving you Canadian Armed Forces policy. I'm not even giving you DRDC policy. I'm giving you my informed opinion as a researcher and I guess as a subject matter expert of sorts. But all of that is informed by the fact that I am 45 years old. And so my understanding of the information environment is very much affected by the fact that I have been here for 45 years. All of those experiences of the pre-9/11 security environment and things like that come into play when it talks about policy solutions, because it's people like me and older who are trying to make policy solutions for people like you and younger. And for a variety of reasons we may get into later, it never goes very well. Obviously, I am a civilian, but I work for the Department of National Defense, and I directly support the Navy. And before that, I was directly supporting the Strategic Joint Staff. So a lot of the way that I think about this stuff is very practical. Like, how do I take all my academic research and write a briefing note for a brigadier general who has maybe 30 seconds to understand what I'm telling him? So I have all the nuance in my head. It doesn't often get into my recommendations for government, although I do try and slip a little bit of Marxism in there sometimes. My training, as I mentioned, is as a political scientist. I am most at home in the Critical Feminist International Relations School. But obviously I work for the Department of National Defense, so we could probably have an interesting conversation just about those two parts right there. I'm a woman. That absolutely affects the way that I think about the information environment. And all of those are partially relevant to the information that I'm going to tell you. So if you ever come across any of these things that I'm talking about in the slides and you're like, that is definitely not the way I think about it, ask yourself which of these factors might be interacting with the way that you are thinking about those things. Let's start with some fun definitions. So I'm part of a NATO research group that is looking at something called defending democracy in the information environment, which is basically us getting together to figure out how can we defend our countries against this stuff without losing what makes our countries themselves. So because I work in that NATO environment, we use the NATO definition for things. There's the NATO definition in all of its glory. And this is a lovely chart from the US military that's supposed to indicate like pan-domain warfare or something, which I just love these because there's no way of actually getting all of this on a slide that makes any sense. And this is sort of graphic representation. But the NATO definition is both somehow too wordy and doesn't actually cover all the things I am important. So I have another definition, which is basically the information environment is everything all around you. So is that very helpful? Not really, in the sense of, I would like to identify this threat in the information environment. But I think it is helpful because it gives you an idea of why we are so bad at this. And I mean, collectively, we in Canada, but also we, I would say, arguably in every Western democracy around the world and in a whole bunch of non-Western non-democracies too. The information environment is basically the mind, body, spirit, so to speak, of everybody on the planet, our built environment, the books we read, the music we listen to, the things you can smell in the room, all of that is part of the information environment. So it's a very exciting place to work in terms of a field of research. It's also insanely challenging because it's both tangible and intangible and hard to think about, and you have to think about it all the time. So maybe that illustration is actually not as inaccurate as I think, because it kind of gives you an idea of what are the chances we could effectively coordinate something like an attack in all those spaces. 0, we could never do that. Some other words that you're going to hear me say during this presentation. Influence, you've probably come across this, influence operations, or that person has influence over me. We don't really have a great fully fleshed out definition of what influence is. Sometimes you'll hear it described as soft power. Sometimes you'll hear it described as like how to win friends and influence people or get rich without trying. All of this stuff is talking about getting people to do what you want them to do. And sometimes that is done persuasively, and sometimes that is being done a little more aggressively, but all of that counts as influence. Here comes the fun stuff. So probably a lot of you are here because I said I was going to talk about disinformation, which is very au courant. I actually am less concerned as a researcher and as a Canadian with disinformation than I am with these second two. So disinformation, classic one, a foreign power, probably Russia, maybe China, puts something out there that is certifiably false, like all Ukrainians are Nazis. And somebody in Global Affairs Canada over at CJOC issues a statement somewhere and says, we would like it to be known that all Ukrainians are not Nazis. And you're like, well, that's great. Good to know. It is relevant in the sense of governments around the world are very concerned about disinformation because it's something tangible that we can point to that an adversary is doing. Oh my God, the Kremlin is sending disinformation narratives into the Canadian information environment, and now Canadians can see them. What should we do? I actually think misinformation, which is the unintentional spreading of false information, is a much bigger deal. And that's because I'm mostly a political scientist who's interested in the Canadian domestic information environment and how that reacts and constrains the Canadian Armed Forces. So the fact that, the Kremlin is out there spreading false information, that's not as big a concern to me as the fact that it's now being spread within Canada by people who believe it. And even worse, if you're thinking about the government context, is malinformation. So malinformation is almost impossible to counter in any way because there's a grain of truth of it. So for example, I have the example here, Ukrainians are Nazis. Some Ukrainians were and are Nazis. So how do you distinguish between the Azov battalion in 2018 and the Azov battalion now versus the deputy prime minister's grandfather, who may or may not have been a collaborator, or that guy that everybody got a round of applause at Parliament Hill. There's no version in which you come out and be like, actually, only some Ukrainians are Nazis. It's just not a very compelling narrative. So from my perspective, malinformation is the scary one because it is compelling, because it's partly true. And not only is it compelling, it's very hard to counter. So I recently gave a version of this talk to some trainee naval officers. And instead of the Ukrainians are Nazis, I used the example of the number of news stories there are about Canadian Armed Forces leaders involved in sex scandals. You can't deny it. And it's also really not a great counter message of actually only some of our senior leaders are sex pests. It's like, that's great. That's fantastic. Jamie, would you like to release that press release that's like, hey guys, 7 out of 10 of our senior leadership are not sexual harassers. It's just not a very great narrative to sell. So that's why I think malinformation is probably the hardest part. Now, I just said the word narrative without explaining what it is. Do we have any English students in the audience? Wow, that's very sad. English is awesome. You guys should all be English. Okay, one good person. So narrative is like a story. And we all have narratives in our minds. There are things called universal narratives. If you've ever watched an action movie or played a first-person shooter, there's like a hero's quest, and you progress through the game, and at the end you get the girl or the guy or the money or whatever power. That's a very common human story, and there's versions of that in basically every culture around the world. We do not, as mammals, assess every little bit of information that comes our way individually. We assess it in according to the stories that we use to make sense of our world. And so the narrative, my colleagues that I work with are very interested and concerned with narratives. What is the adversary's narrative about Canada? What are the narratives we are telling about the war in Ukraine or the Israel-Hamas conflict? Narratives are really the way in which humans remember and process information. I got this lovely screenshot from Googling, I think, internet influencer or something that came up. So here's a lovely woman who would like to tell you about the makeup she wears. Information is the way that influence gets spread. So we already talked a little bit about what influence is. Influence is basically everything, but I want to just draw your attention to this part here and the way in which there's an influence at the domestic level and an influence internationally, and those two things interact. So again, this is what I think about a lot. Foreign influence in Canada, city council elections, municipal elections, federal elections. Are we thinking about some evil state somewhere who wants a certain voting outcome for their own reasons? That's a real thing. But also at the United Nations, China is very interested in having Taiwan be isolated. And so China uses its influence to get countries to abandon Taiwan and vote for their one China policy and vote for them on UN resolutions. And so is that two different problems? Is that one problem with two effects? Is it two completely unrelated things? It's two stories about Chinese influence. And do they interact? Probably. So what is that message that they're using and why? What is the influence being used for? What is the outcome of the influence? I have to say, this part at the bottom seems to increasingly be the answer in terms of when I think of what are foreign adversaries or even foreign entities doing in the Canadian information space, they're making us all really angry and they're making us trust nobody. And that is basically the goal, because that alone is enough to significantly, oh God, I'm going to use that horrible military phrase, degrade the Canadian state. And I can't think of what the civilian word for degrade is, so I'm just going to say degrade, even though it's gross and I feel shame. But yeah, so be angry and trust no one is actually a really effective tool. How did we get here? So we got here, I told you there'd be marks of them. We got here very slowly and inexorably, and nobody noticed until it got really bad really quickly, and now we're scrambling to catch up. So when people ask me, do you have any good references that I can suggest for readings for you about information warfare? I'm like, yeah, there's two, and they're both really from the late 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And one is a book by somebody named Neil Postman called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And he wrote it about how bad television was for American politics. So like, talk about being a long time ago. He has this whole hypothesis about the way in which political messaging and political deliberation used to be a slow in-person process in which we had these long debates, and people, like literally itinerant politicians, would come and you would go into your church hall and hear them speak, and you would listen for 4 or 5 hours. And his argument in, I think, 88 was basically that cable news has ruined our attention span and permanently destroyed that idea of being a deliberative democracy. So that was in the 80s. And you can imagine if he were alive now, he'd be like, wow, I should have just lit that on fire and screamed. It would have been, talk about how does that look now in the information age? It does not look any better. We are not any better at being deliberative citizens than we were when Postman wrote that book in 88. And then the other book I would recommend is from the 90s, and again, another American, and it's called Bowling Alone. And it's a book about social capital by the political scientist Robert Putnam. And when he was thinking about this stuff in the early 90s, He was thinking about the transition from one income, one career households in which both parents were married, and you would have one spouse, and I'll be honest, it was always the wife, who was mostly making social capital for the community while paid employment was going on. And when you think about social capital, we think about a lot of stuff that seems kind of quaint and twee now: bowling leagues, church, the women's league, 4-H clubs, scouts, going to things at the library, in-person concerts, actually talking to people in general in person, all of these things that, especially since the pandemic, just seemed like a totally different lifetime ago. But his hypothesis was essentially that the way in which our political structures and institutional structures have been built, the country that we still live in now, the world in which we inhabit, was built for an entirely different way of living that has, even in the early 2000s, late 90s, was disappearing. And let me tell you, has only disappeared more. And so basically, the stuff that makes it possible to live together in this sort of imperfect world in which we find ourselves had all gone away. And the net result is we're lonely, we're really bored, we're very bad at entertaining ourselves, we don't trust anybody, and we're kind of sad a lot. Sounds like a pretty cool place to launch some Kremlin narratives, doesn't it? To an environment of people who have lost touch with their community. Unfortunately, this stuff has interacted with the economic imperatives of neoliberalism or capitalism, late stage capitalism, how we want to claim it, and accelerated that rush towards being individuals, to only having ourselves to rely on. My favorite version of Putnam's speech is, you can find it online, and he talk about elite speech, but he's like, you know, my buddy and I used to go to classical music concerts together, and I don't like Schopenhauer, but I would sit through the Schopenhauer to listen to the classics. But my buddy really likes it. He would sit through the, Mozart to listen to the Schopenhauer. Well, now I don't have to listen to the Schopenhauer. I just put a record on and listen to what I want at home. Again, many of you were like, what the hell is she talking about? What is Schopenhauer? And also, what is a record? But the point of which is, we used to have to spend a lot of time in rooms like this, listening to things that we maybe didn't care about necessarily, to get to the part where we did care. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with like a vaudeville routine, or the way that theaters used to have a bill of 8 performers, 7 of them would be terrible, and you would sit through until the last one. That used to be the way in which we did a lot of things: politics, community groups. You were always forced to be around people that maybe you didn't necessarily like, to listen to things that were kind of boring. But the net result was that you had an idea of your community around you, and it included people that were totally not like you. And what we have now is, I'm going to get back to this in a second. What we have now is this. So this is my collection of stuff I found on the internet that I think kind of summarizes a lot of stuff that Putnam and others have predicted about the world now and how it contributes to our vulnerability information environment. So this, many of you, this is vegan dog food. So that comes out of an internet community that is small, but powerful enough to have found a necessity for vegan dog food. This is why I, as a parent of teenagers, cry a lot. These are TikTok challenges. So like, if you could, if you put your evil wizard cap on 20 years ago and told me that like, I predict a time in which a Chinese state-owned media is going to get teenagers to accidentally kill themselves doing really dumb shit for the camera, I'd be like, come on. I lived through the Cold War. That's not going to happen. Here we are. And then this is one of my favorite cartoonists. And I think kind of encapsulates this way in which we have all been allowed to listen to our own echo chambers. And so why is this happening? So we talked a little bit about the social parts. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the interaction between technology and our brains. And again, why we're so bad at this. So on this side, we have a list of things on the technological side that make the information environment really bad and hard to defend against. And that is the sheer volume of information. So going back to the slide about the feet pics and 600-pound life, like, if you're an old person like I am, then you remember when the internet was dial-up and there were like 7 websites you could visit and they were mostly boring, but it was still kind of exciting. And now it's like this particular fan fiction in which the main character has 3 legs and brown hair does not hold my attention because I like my fan fiction to have 3 legs and red hair, but with blonde tints. So I'm going to click, 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 click. There's so much out there. I can't even, in the time we've been having this chat, there's probably 17 other blogs that have been started just by your student friends around here. So the sheer volume of information, we cannot process it. The way that our brains work, we still have a very old-fashioned mammal way of thinking, which is primarily about social orientation and primarily about storytelling and cognitive shortcuts or heuristics. We do not have any way to actually process the amount of information that is all around us. So the general social mammal orientation over here, if you've bought a product recently, you probably read a review for it online. And you didn't know the people who were writing the reviews, but it didn't really matter because we have, you can call it evolved, you can grown up, whatever you want to call it. We rely on the community around us, whether it's real or imagined, for basically, is this safe? Is this good? So I'm going to stop right here and say that I am not an evolutionary psychologist and I have a lot of beef with the field in general, but evolutionary neurobiology is kind of interesting in its own way. But we rely on what other people have already told us is good and safe. So you can see immediately the connection to misinformation. Well, Bill at the Rotary Club had this really interesting theory about 15-minute cities. And I know Bill, he's a good guy. So clearly the stuff he's going to tell me about why Justin Trudeau wants to turn me into a bug-eating bike is valid information, right? It sounds kind of weird, but that is the way we process information. And so the Sephora review and Bill at the Rotary Club is all kind of part and parcel of the same thing. So the speed of information transfer, in addition to there being a lot of information, we get it really quickly. Have you watched You've Got Mail? You're all young. Why would you have watched You've Got Mail? Go and find it. I know you have 18 different streaming services. It's a charming movie about people who were famous when I was younger, falling in love via email, when email was still a thing. And you will be amazed, A, that this used to pass for entertainment, and B, how slowly and long it took to get an email and how exciting it was. And if you're thinking about it, like I'm getting notifications from my daughter on my phone, on my wristwatch right now. Like I'm not dialing up to call and see what kind of email there is there. That the speed at which all of the information reaches us is something that we are not capable of handling. Because again, in our information processing processes, we're looking for shortcuts, heuristics. That's a reliable person, or I know what this is, pattern recognition, or that doesn't agree with my worldview, so I'm going to discount it. Cognitive dissonance, all of these are shortcuts we use to deal with the information that we have now. This part, the technological aspect, I don't care. That's boring. I don't like these people. I no longer have to pay attention to it. I don't even have to read a newspaper anymore. So, as an information holdout, I still subscribe to a couple of newspapers, but they don't deliver them in Victoria anymore. So I get my newspapers online. And you actually have to go to the Global Mail website and figure out how to read the paper in its virtual form, because otherwise you get the internet version. So I don't even have to turn a page and ignore the business section. I don't even have to click on the business section anymore. It's like it doesn't exist. So even if you are still in bed in that dead tree, archaic information environment the way I am, we're still removing those barriers to having to even realize that other people who don't think like us are around us. The constant expansion and contraction of what we consider us, which is facilitated by the internet. So this is going beyond the imagined communities that are great into, why do I know so much about Lethbridge municipal politics? Like I live in Victoria. Alberta does not need to even exist for me. Why do I know about this stuff? Why am I outraged about whatever Rob Ford's doing, or he's dead, but Doug Ford? We know about this stuff, and now we care about this stuff. When 50 years ago, I might have known Lethbridge existed, but I certainly wouldn't have cared what they were doing with their municipal councils. That has obviously good parts to it. The downside, if you go back to that, be angry all the time and trust no one. The downside is there's a lot more stuff that we can be angry about and be disheartened by and be less be distrust about. And this gets us into the cocaine lever. I should explain this. I like to joke that my colleagues at DRDC Toronto who get to do the cool like human factors and psychology stuff are like rats and cocaine scientists, and I'm a political scientist. They don't actually give rats cocaine, so please, for the recording, make it clear that I'm not implying that anybody within government gives rats cocaine. But that dopamine hit of being angry all the time, it works so well. Our brains have so little defense against it. It's like, that's money to people's ears. And we fall for it every time because we're kind of wired that way, going back to that social orientation. And now this brings me down to this part, which is not actually really a part of our brain chemistry, but is related to the meat sack world in which we live in. All of our institutions were built for a world that no longer exists. And they're failing because they were built for a different world, and they're run by people who are my age and older. And we have a legacy nostalgia for things like free speech in its unfettered form, or a triumph of constituent democracy, or you know what this really needs is more debate, because debate is how you get to truth. And that might have been true 50 years ago, although that's kind of debatable too. It is not true anymore. And all of the stuff on the left-hand column means the stuff on the right-hand column doesn't work anymore. And in particular, our institutions don't work. So we've already seen this. The feet pics thing. Oh, anyway. Oh, okay. So here's the official part of my talk again. The foreign adversaries. Absolutely, other countries are interested in harming Canada and Canadians, either Canada because we're Canada, or Canada because we're close allies with the US, or Canada because we're part of NATO, or Canada because they hate maple syrup, whatever. Absolutely, other governments are targeting us as Canadians, our Canadian institutions, our Canadian government for bad reasons, maliciously. Things like troll farms absolutely exist. Russia 100% has people on its payroll that are creating memes, narratives, whatever, that are designed to harm our institutions. Yes, you should absolutely delete TikTok. And just, I don't care if you're thinking of me as like your mom's age who's telling you this, or as the government research or whatever, but like absolutely just get rid of TikTok. It's bad. TikTok is bad for a variety of reasons. Get your grandparents to stop watching Fox News. When Epoch Times is delivered to your doorway, just put the cat litter on it and throw it out. Like, you can do some things to harden yourself against malicious information actors. But the bigger problem that I have, and that I'm hopefully bringing you along in the argument, is that the how and the why of Russian disinformation campaigns is way less relevant and way less of a problem to the fact that these interact with our information environment in Canada, our Canadian political system, our partisan politics in ways that make it really hard to root out. So, for example, you hear this phrase like Kremlin narratives. Who here thinks that NATO is unabashedly a great thing, that Western powers have never done anything bad militarily, and that the US is a force for good, full stop, in the world? Congratulations, you're all Kremlin narrative believers, right? How dare you have any feelings of anti-imperialism, or that NATO might have done something wrong, or that the US is bad. Problem is, those troll farms absolutely are pushing out that kind of narrative all the time. Absolutely, I could point to, maybe a news story in Ricochet or the Tyee that is sort of like, why are they talking about this now? Like, where are they getting this information? Maybe some of that is from the Russian government in some ways, maybe. Doesn't matter. It's also an entirely legitimate and genuine political belief that Canadians have and have had for a long time. And so there's no way of saying that person is a Kremlin stooge. Maybe they are. It doesn't matter. There's another slide in which I'm basically just going to have a little cry in front of you, but we'll get to why this is hard in a second. I just want you to understand why I'm so passionate about this. And it's only actually partly to do with the fact that this makes it harder for the Canadian Armed Forces to operate. It's also that all of these things that we, to be honest, hold dear as Canadians, whether we know it or not, these sort of institutions that are at risk now are some very big ones. So I've got some, elections, courts, the healthcare system. I think we saw that come in the COVID pandemic, but our education system, national security, education system. So recently, Reddit did like a year-end review that kind of was like, which accounts from where posted the most in which subreddits. And in a bunch of subreddits for small Alberta communities, Russian IP addresses were super involved in the SOGI and gender questions in Alberta curriculum. And so can I tell you for sure that those were Russian trolls who were super invested in a very small subreddit and somewhere in rural Alberta? No. Do I think it is? Yes. And does that have really bad outcomes for any sort of civilized or productive debate around what should be taught in schools? Yeah, that is bad. And it's not bad because of the presence of those individual actors. It's bad because other people pick up on that anger and distrust and are fueled by it and share those misinformation narratives. Again, it's not disinformation. The government can't say that's wrong and shut it down. It's misinformation and it's malinformation. And some of it's actually just opinion, which is, good. But this part here, evidence-informed elite decision-making, doesn't actually sound like anything you kind of want to be a part of. It's really key to almost everything that is good in your life right now. It's wonks. It's people like me, it's bureaucrats who have as a job to sift through mountains of evidence and come up with policy recommendations, which are sometimes, be honest, totally ignored by the politicians who get to put those into practice. But the fact that evidence is gathered and presented to our decision makers is a really important and fundamental aspect of what being a functional society is. And these two parts, evidence-informed and elite decision-making, are both at risk of being, I don't even know what the word for it, laid waste by our current information environment. And this part here, where I can come as a representative of the federal government and tell you that I believe in something called the common good, it's pretty cringy even now. But in 10 years' time, it's probably not even going to be possible because everybody will be so skeptical about the idea of a common good, much less a national interest or a national emblem. Like, we're Canadians, we're not really that great at that stuff anyway. It's very contested. It's been contested for a long time, but there was kind of like a kernel of it, let's say a national accommodation to each other. I really do think that's at stake. So this part here, some of you might be thinking, yeah, but Andrea, those institutions are terrible. Some of them are, let's face it, a lot of them have racist aspects, have historical injustices built into them. Elitism is probably bad. And those opportunities to become part of the policy wonk sphere are not equitably distributed. I get it. And I share a lot of those concerns. But I don't think that the part in which we replace those institutions with something else, A, I'm not totally sure it can be done. And B, if it's going to be done, it's going to look a lot like Pol Pot's Cambodia. So a lot of people are going to die. And C, I'm not actually convinced it can be done. So I hear what you're saying, that some of those institutions are terrible and maybe something else would be better. I'm not generally a cynical person. I am very unsure that this happens without a lot of bloodshed. You can argue that war is a fantastic policy window, and a lot of my colleagues do argue that, and it's a little scary to hear. But yes, war is a fantastic way to make policy changes if you're only interested in the fact that your policy gets changed. If you're interested in the sort of social effects around war, it's maybe something a little different. So here's the part where, I have a little cry or tell you why I'm not good. There aren't really any answers to any of this. So I want to explain to you why I have a hard time answering any of these questions. So We talked a little bit about the Kremlin stooge narrative, and that's a real thing. But the beauty of Canada is that it doesn't matter which foreign entity you talk about. There are Canadians from that background in Canada, influencing policy, living in their communities, contributing, and having thoughts that are influenced by whatever their identity is. The same way that I told you a little bit about my identity and background at the beginning of that. That is part of what makes any country exciting, and it's part of what makes Canada Canada. But it makes it really hard if you're interested in having a discussion about disinformation, or it makes it even harder if you think that the solution is to say, that's false, that's a fact, that's allowable, that. In any country, that's hard to do, but in Canada, I think it's more challenging than most because, and while we can have a discussion as to whether it's lip service or true, we at least do give lip service to the idea that we live in a pluralistic democracy in which a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian, in which we don't assume the Canadians of Chinese descent are all stooges of the Chinese state, et cetera, et cetera. We haven't always done that. We live in BC. I'm pretty sure Abbotsford, there were people interned near here during the Second World War. So we have a relatively recent history of what it looks like when you don't have those policies in place. So absolutely, we could probably go back to a time in which we assumed that foreign-born Canadians and foreign-born residents were stooges of their home countries. I don't think it's going to get us anywhere close to being safe, and it's certainly going to destroy what we think about as being Canadian. So, but you know, let's go back to those Kremlin stooge narratives. Can they be fact-checked? Can you fact-check something like the statement, America is not a force for good in the world? No. I mean, even if there was a factual claim in there, which there isn't really, there's no one truth about a state and its actions. There's no one truth about Canada in which you could immaculately say the following things happened. This is the historical record. These are all facts. That isn't the way that anything works, but it's particularly not the way that states work. So there's no way a lot of this stuff can be fact checked. And even if it could, by whom? Who is going to do the fact checking? Do I get to do it? I have 3/4 of a PhD and I'm paid by the federal government to research this stuff. So obviously I get to do the fact check, right? I mean, I'm going to read your email and decide if you are a disinformation vector. That's my job. I'm an expert. Are you okay with it? Look at me. I'm friendly. I'm white. What could go wrong? Like, it's great. Okay, so it's not me. Is it Dr. Akufo? He's pretty cool. He could read my email. I mean, be pretty boring, but you know, maybe we're gonna each nominate a designated person. So I'm gonna randomly assign a citizen. Joe can read my email and he can decide if it's legitimate. You can see in practice that there's no version of this in which everybody decides who gets to be the fact checker. How about who gets to repress them? So we've gotten over the fact checking stage and we've decided that these things are dangerous disinformation. Who gets to make that decision and who gets to repress them? Is it your city council, provincial government, federal government, the Canadian Armed Forces? Which of our institutions would you trust to do that? Not only that, but like which of those institutions would be trusted by a plurality of Canadians and therefore have the legitimacy to do it? We're kind of seeing this unfold right now with, is it C-18, the online harms bill? Almost everyone thinks that the internet is a way in which people are genuinely harmed, especially kids. Child sexual abuse materials, this has been a long-term concern. Most people are broadly on board with the idea that you should not be allowed to profit from child sexual abuse material, and that includes, you know, Meta or whoever's hosting them. Great, so we have agreement on this. Do we have agreement on how we prevent children from accessing pornography? No, we don't. Do we have an agreement on what counts as pornography more generally? Nope. Do we have an agreement on what counts as harmful? No. Do we have an agreement on who counts as a group in which harm can be attached or identified? No, we don't. And that's not because Canadians are really bad at this or because we're particularly polarized. There's no democracy in the world in which those things are decided. And so this gets me to my NATO research group, in which allegedly we are comparing best practices, but mostly we're just, oh my God, how are things going in your country? Really badly. How about you? Yeah, terrible. Like it's interesting It's fantastic in some ways because there's things that we have in common, like the farmers' protests. So the farmers' protests, I have colleagues from Germany and the Netherlands, and we're all experiencing some version of the yellow vest farmers thing and talking about, how is Germany dealing with it? And for the most part, we've come up with kind of similar things. Well, we're hoping that we can teach students, like children and high school students, better media literacy, critical media literacy. Great. That hasn't been proven to work, but we're going to do it anyway. How about pre-bunking? So if we know what the narrative is coming out, then we can issue our own narrative. And so citizens can be pre-bunked. It doesn't work either, but at least feels like doing something. How about fact checking? We're all doing that. Doesn't work either. So there's a version of things in which we know what we have to try because you have to try. And then there's a version of which in which we're honest with each other about what doesn't work. And unfortunately, most of the things that don't work are the things we have to try. And the things that we do know work, the only thing that works is regulating the internet so there's less information coming in. And guess what? Nobody in that NATO research group is willing to suggest that to government because we recognize that it fundamentally violates an aspect of free speech that we've come to believe is integral to our communities. So I have a feeling I'm getting close to overtime. 15-minute city game. So the 15-minute city game is I tell you what I think is a 15-minute city, and then you tell me all of the things you've heard about 15-minute cities. So the technocratic version of a 15-minute city is that I have a vision for all Canadians to be able to live within 15 minutes, a 15-minute walk in my version of things, from their home, their grocery store, their family doctor, their place of worship or their school, or for anything they want to do is easily accessible to them and their family, and they get to walk there or bicycle if that's what they want, and it's glorious, and there's a lot of Skittles. The Skittles is my own part. That's not really official government policy. What's the 15-minute city that you might have heard? Does it involve social ID of any sort? Does it involve you showing your ID to get in and out of a neighborhood? Does it involve eating bugs? Does it involve not being allowed to have a car? Does it involve being forced to ride a bicycle? I mean, maybe it does. I'm assuming if you haven't personally heard these narratives, then you've at least heard of them. The 15-minute city is such a fantastic illustration of how things that are extremely well-intentioned can be distorted and how those distortions spread in a time of zero trust. So in Oxford, England, they basically decided to install a congestion charge in the central part of their city. And it was basically, if you don't live there, you had to pay a little bit to bring your car into that zone. This got combined into the 15-minute city narrative and the COVID lockdowns into the government is going to force you to stay in your neighborhood and you wouldn't be allowed to leave unless you showed your passport, et cetera, et cetera. Now, when I'm telling it to you, it sounds totally insane, but that's because we're not in the information environment to make sense. But each of those little narratives gets strung together into a broader narrative of, I don't trust my government, and I don't trust my narrative, or I don't trust my neighbor. And I'm scared. And I'm scared of COVID, and I'm scared of people dying, and I'm scared of inflation. And I really like eating meat, and I don't know any vegetarians, and they seem kind of distrustful. And, I also like my car, but mostly I don't like my government, and I don't like my neighbors. I don't like the European Union. That came into it as well. But it's the perfect storm. If everybody got the chance to be able to explain what the 15-minute city was individually on each citizen's doorstep, probably it wouldn't be that big a deal. We don't metaphorically even have that opportunity anymore, much less physically. So how does this affect the CAF? So speaking of only some of our leadership are sexual predators. Who here has heard a positive news story about the Canadian Armed Forces, or any news story about the Canadian Armed Forces in the past month? One person. Cool. Jamie, you don't count. Put your hand down. Okay, Noah, you're professionally not. Okay, so like 4 of you are willing to admit it. Are any of you affiliated in any way with the Canadian Armed Forces? Family members, reservists, any of that? So you're genuinely civilians. Okay, the 3 of you nodding, not you, Jamie. Good stories or bad stories? Bad. Yeah. Okay, yeah, so that's fairly factual, actually. Yeah. How about you guys? What did you guys hear?
Pretty much the same sort of thing, all about like how we're the only NATO country not meeting certain requirements and stuff. And of course, whenever I'm in the moment, I can interpret specific ones, but I know I've seen about like Canadian troops deployed in like various conflict zones around the world as well. And
Okay.
I find those are never treated with a lot of like ooh-rah kind of narrative. It's always a bit more like, we have stuff deployed there, like this is the situation. I mean, very like neutral.
Yeah. Anybody hear anything about like ponytails or white men can't be recruited anymore, or general wokeness or any of that stuff? Or hey, the sexual pet predator narrative, it's always a popular one. I mean, to be honest, we're woefully underprepared. That's kind of like, that's a victory in terms of the other stuff that could have been there. So did you trust the media story you were reading about the CAF? Did it seem fairly reliable? You said it was kind of neutral and boring, but did that make it seem more trustworthy?
I don't necessarily distrust everything I read.
I
would try to apply a more critical lens in my own mind, but not overly critical. Like I try to look at these stories and think, okay, like what is happening? Like what does this say about what is happening? I don't know, like if that's always like applicable or not, but
okay, you're really making this hard for me to make my point here, because that's great, and I'm very glad that you were doing that. But I was hoping you were like, I only get my news from Reddit, and so I don't know, I just read like the meme site or whatever. But no, this is fantastic. So let's think about more broadly. BC fire season last year, did it go well? Not really. Was there an information component to some of the stuff that went on in the fire season? Yeah, there was a lot of kind of what I would call 15-minute city stories redux, broad lack of trust in the RCMP, anger with the BC Forest Service, a lot of that urban elite versus rural good guys, kind of feet on the ground type thing. So the Canadian Armed Forces is often involved in forest firefighting. And so it may seem irrelevant what's happening in the Okanagan in the fire season, but it's actually an operational concern for the Canadian Armed Forces. Because you can imagine you're a low-level soldier who's been sent to fight the fire, and you're asked to go door to door in a community under threat to evacuate people. And you get to the door and you're like, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And in that information environment, it's not entirely clear if that will be well received. So now you have people who are unwilling to listen to the government to evacuate. They're unwilling to interact with the CAF at their door, and they're dying in fires. Not only is that an operational failure, it's really, really hard on your personnel to know I had an opportunity to help, and for whatever reason, for things that are entirely out of my control, people died, and I was there, and I couldn't do anything about it. All of us would feel terrible about that. But if you've joined the forces, probably not for the great pay, but to do something good for your fellow Canadians, it's even worse. So, sometimes I have to explain to my military clients like why I'm doing the research I have. And this is always the way that I come back to it, is there will be more and more calls on the Canadian Armed Forces to do domestic stuff. And the more calls there are in the domestic context, the more our domestic information environment is going to work, or is going to matter. And I would say the prognosis for our domestic information environment is not great. Let's talk about the CAF does things abroad. So, I don't know if any of you were following what was happening in Niger more recently, or other places in the Sahel where there's been a lot of coup happening. Niger is the most recent one because the Canadian Armed Forces, our Special Operations Forces, have been involved in training troops in the Niger for quite a while in counterterrorism as part of state security capacity building in support of US military. We do a lot of foreign military training. People want Canadians to train them because we're good at it, we're professional. Difficulty is, there's some pretty solid research on this, the correlation between foreign trained military and those troops being involved in coups, very strong. So while we have a very civilian-led approach to civil military relations, when we go and train state security apparatus in other countries, especially states that are in some degree of failure, a lot of times for stuff that we've done, to be perfectly honest, we end up training the very people who overthrow democracy with force. It's not the Canadian Armed Forces' fault, but in that context, we are now involved in an information conflict. So what do you do about it? What do you do about the optics of, there were some pretty memorable photos that came out of what looked to be like white guys in Jeeps involved in the Niger coup. I think actually it turned out to be Wagner operatives, but still, it's not a great look. So on the hypocrisy side of things, I guess, am I accusing my own government of hypocrisy? No. But I think you know what I mean when I say we talk a big talk in Canada currently and historically. We have pretty high-minded ideals about what we are as a country and what we do with our foreign policy, human rights, women's rights, development, that kind of thing. And when we don't live up to those things, for example, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons, that's one that China's hitting us a lot with the narratives recently. When we don't live up to our own hype, it's the easiest narrative in the world to write if you're an adversary. Oh, well, you know, Canada claims to do X, Y, and Z, but actually they're just imperious lackeys who do the bidding of the US and the UK, who don't have a really great historical record in a lot of the countries that we're very interested in influencing, for example. So are we being hoisted by our own petard? Should we just stop talking about LGBTQ rights, for example, if it doesn't win us any friends in Uganda or other places in Africa? That is a decision way above my pay grade. But you need to know about the way that who we are as a country and the way that we market ourselves leaves us vulnerable to foreign narratives, because it's so easy to say, oh, Australia, you're against nuclear proliferation, and yet you're going to buy nuclear submarines with the US. Is it rules for thee and not for me? I mean, yes, there's a lot of hypocrisy built into the rules-based international order. And if you aren't cognizant of that, you can be taken by surprise by adversary narratives. And then this stuff, I just like the Tinder in the field story. So that's kind of the strategic level, the way in which the information environment affects the Canadian Armed Forces. At a more tactical on the ground part. So Canadian troops in Latvia have been absolutely targeted by Russian information operations, alleging all sorts of things like, you know, sexually assaulting local women, blah, blah, blah. That is kind of easier in some ways to combat. You can pre-harden your troops against it and you can counter narrative. And the fact that they're there at the invitation of the Latvian government makes that a lot easier to take. The more difficult problem is what I call, so I've put here young people doing dumb stuff. It's really young men doing dumb stuff, let's be honest. There was a fantastic story a couple of years ago. American soldiers at like a special operating base somewhere in the Middle East were leaving their Strava Fitbit things on while going for runs around their secret base. And those maps were being uploaded to the cloud, which is an example of one of those things like, if you're not thinking of yourself as an information vector, you don't catch these things. And the other one that has come out, especially during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is guys using Tinder in the field, which is just amazing on so many levels. But it's actually one of those places in which if you are a Russian military leader, you're probably at least as old as I am, I'm probably older. You're not even thinking about, hey, should I tell my guys not to use Tinder? Because you don't use Tinder. And so it's not a part of your worldview, and therefore it's not a part of your security checklist. And then the problem is if you're a Tinder user, you maybe are not thinking about it as a security risk either, which is why women should be in charge of everything. No, I'm joking. Not really, actually, but yeah. So, you know, here's some kind of high-minded strategic aspects and some slightly body ways of thinking about tactical stuff. So I like to end on a high note. What can be done? Very little. Thank you for coming. No, there are some things that can be done, and they seem small and inconsequential, but I think they do have enough of an effect that it's worth me putting them on the slide. So get to know who funds your media And not in like, oh my God, put on the tinfoil hat conspiracy, but just if you're, so this comes up in my line of work a lot because a lot of people in the military don't have a lot of time. And so, you know, if they can find like a think tank report that is about the issue they're interested in and it's produced and it's slick, it's right there, it's ready to go, it's very attractive. And then when you start asking questions like, oh, the Cato Foundation. So do you know anything about the Cato Foundation, sir? It's a libertarian think tank. Okay, so what? Why do I care? Well, libertarianism has the following kind of, oh, well, that's, yeah, well, you know, so being aware of the funding of what you read, but also kind of the pond in which it swims is a good way of having a better understanding of why you are seeing that particular piece of news. So, you know, it's not that you shouldn't distrust, it's not that you should distrust the media, but you should understand that the person that pays the piper is the person that picks the tune. And increasingly, there are no media, there are very few media and especially kind of research institutions that don't have a piper somewhere picking at least a couple of the tunes in the playlist. The second one is sometimes a little harder to get into because of the way that we have tended to circulate into our own social spaces that have been chosen because we all like the same things or we all listen to the same music or whatever, is be very skeptical when everybody in your social group agrees on something. So if you're like, hey, all of my friends think guys are gross, and you're like, yeah, fair, you know, you've got this lived experience or whatever. Some of that's legitimate, but some of you kind of might want to investigate, like, why are there no guys in your group? Well, because guys are gross. Yeah, okay, fine, but you got to go back to it. Or, you know, I'm using it like an objectively hilarious, but just understand that there is nothing in life in which there's no debate, like nothing, genuinely nothing. There's nothing that I do at work. We can have some arguments about the context of science. Like there's a few things fine, you know, gravity and stuff like that. But the stuff that you and your friends argue about or that you read about, there's always room for debate. And if you're in an environment in which nobody is having that debate, even a little bit, that makes you, to get to my third point, vulnerable in an information capacity. So we are all vulnerable for a variety of reasons, and understanding why is a good way of making yourself more resilient against disinformation and malinformation. So sex, I don't mean like, are you getting any and does that make you vulnerable? I mean, being male or female or man and woman has an impact on the certain kinds of information vulnerabilities. So part of this comes out of my experience of teaching in military college. We've done a pretty good job of expanding the definition of femininity, what it means to be a woman in the 21st century. We haven't done the same for men and boys. We've done a fairly good job of identifying which aspects of masculinity are bad for society and bad for men. We haven't done a very good job of encouraging men to think about positive masculinity. And so young men, you guys are vulnerable to a certain form of radicalization that is about grievance, that is about your sisters and your female friends getting ahead of you, about preferential hiring for women in the trades, all of these things. It's not disinformation. I said it would probably be malinformation. But there's enough of you, and enough of you are consumers and voters, that foreign adversaries are definitely interested in having you as young men, and particularly as young white men, but as young men in general, be really angry and just, I saw that, that's so funny, as being really angry and distrustful. And ideally violent, actually, to be honest. So that's a vulnerability that you have as a man. Ideology, if you are in the minority of your voting patterns in a classroom, for example, all the time, and you're like, God damn it, I can't be heard as an XYZ person, that makes you vulnerable. That anger, that grievance makes you vulnerable. And it doesn't matter which side of the political spectrum you're on, it's that feeling of being unheard. That makes you vulnerable. Your national origin. If you in the Canadian media environment are constantly listening to stories about how your fellow countrymen, other international students, people who share the same ethnic background are bad or a problem, that makes you vulnerable. And conversely, if you are a consumer of that news, so old stock Canadians, that makes you vulnerable too. Your linguistic group, your hobbies, all of these things have an information and influence dimension. And I'm not going to go through all of them because I don't even know half of your hobbies, and I don't really want to get back to the feet pics part. But you just have to have an awareness of who you are as a person and as an individual, but as a group member, and how that makes you vulnerable. What are some other things you can do to harden yourself or to make Canada a safer place? Touch grass. But yes, touch grass. Go volunteer, join a league, safely talk to the friendly weirdos on the bus. I want you to essentially put yourself, again, safely and within the context of safety, in an environment in which you're around people that you don't like very much, and then just kind of sit with it and enjoy it. It's a magical part of being human that we've largely gotten away from. And interesting things happen when you feel out of place and bored, especially the bored place. Go to your professor's office hours. I know that sounds ridiculous, but sometimes that feeling of being vulnerable and being alone and being unloved or unnoticed, a little bit of human interaction can help. And I always encourage you to talk to your professors because they've had zero training in how to deal with any of your personal problems, but they are obliged to be there for 1 to 3 hours a week. So you can always find them. So, and here's the cringy touch grass. Just get off the internet. It's bad for you. I'm a huge hypocrite. I'm on the internet all the time. I was until quite recently a Twitter addict because I used to use Twitter in my research, and Twitter was how I stayed in touch with my friends in academia. And also Twitter is where you get breaking news, and Twitter is where you get all the weirdest aspects of all the comments which go into my research. I had to break up with Twitter because I was actively encouraging the world to be a terrible place by participating in Twitter, sorry, X. That decision was hard for me, but now it feels kind of liberating, in part because it takes me 6 to 7 hours longer to hear the news, which is fantastic sometimes. It means that I'm possibly less productive in terms of being the person who always knew what was going on in the office, but it allows me to have more perspective on what I'm hearing, which is also important. So you have to decide for yourself, which part of the internet could I give up that would make my life slightly more boring, but also probably better? I'm hoping it's TikTok. Please get off TikTok. But I think this is my closing remark. Yes. So malinformation, if you go back to my definitions, malinformation, little kernels of truth, but why are you hearing it? So kernels of truth stripped of nuance, kernels of truth that are being magnified or amplified for whatever reason. If you ask yourself, why am I seeing this story right now? Particularly like the editorial section of the Globe and Mail, you'd be like, why am I seeing all these realtors talk? Oh yeah, there's a policy announcement. But that kind of awareness of stuff. Why am I seeing this story right now? And who benefits from my seeing this story? Who benefits from my reading this story, from my clicking on this site? Who benefits from my being angry about this story? That will go a long way to making yourself less vulnerable to all of the information aspects, the negative information aspects. Like, I'm not talking about, hardening yourself against the Chinese government or whatever. I'm really talking about getting to a point in which 50 years' time, this conversation is able to be held in the same kind of context that we're having it now. And I know that sounds like gross hyperbole. And yeah, the lady from the Department of National Defense has come here to scare young people. I genuinely think that we are at a period of time of transition in which all of our old institutions have failed us. And it is not at all clear that we're replacing them with anything at all, much less anything better. And when you pull those big foundational pieces out of the Jenga block that is this quite nice life that we have, relatively and comparatively speaking, I don't know what happens. I wish I did. But so questions, and just a little note down here at the bottom. So we hire students. Personally, I do hire research assistants, but DRDC hires FSWEP. The Department of National Defense has the Policy Officer Recruitment Program. It's mostly for master's level students, but there's a lot of ways in which, if you would like to also become an agent of the state, you can. It's cool. We have a pension and stuff. So yeah, if you're looking for a summer job, or you are interested in the kind of graduate work you could do in security, so you too could give this presentation, please send me an email or come talk to me, because there are a lot of really smart people that I work with. And, you know, in the context of a giant faceless bureaucracy that one could argue is supporting something kind of evil. Not really, I'm teasing, but it's a pretty exciting place to work. And I do, probably the one part of the defense team concept that doesn't make me die of cringe is this idea that we are working together to make Canada safer, to protect that part of Canada, however you want to define it. And I do think that it is an interesting way of, you know, public service, but serving the public, and with marginally less risk of death than being in the Canadian Armed Forces. So come join us. Okay, that's all for me.
I think it's on. There we go. Okay. Put it down on the side. So thank you. That was really informative and just amazing. So it's evident that the media influences how Canadians perceive like Canadian armed forces, and that we perceive CAF to be more negatively, like in a negative way, as opposed to the US. So due to the sexual harassment narrative, as well as the underfunded and underprepared narrative, what do you think CAF or the Canadian government could do to change the narrative and the negative perception of CAF?
That is an amazing question. So my colleague here is actually a military public affairs officer, so I'm not going to let him speak, even though this is technically his part of the job. But I love this question because the answer is so hard to pin down. So this is a sentiment that I encounter in working with the military quite often. Like, how do we get Canadians to care more about the military, or to, you know, get to the thank you to our troops kind of stage of things? And why does David Pugliese write so many negative stories, et cetera, et cetera? And it's related to the why don't Canadians want to spend more on defense, that kind of thing. And what I tell my military colleagues is, you don't get to have that sort of positive feeling / adoration of the troops that you get in the US and in the UK as well, without all of the stuff that goes into it. So they have a much more militarized society than we do. A higher percentage of people who've been in the military. They have
more defense spending, more defense contractors, less tolerance of people speaking ill of the military, like just a whole bunch of things. And so you can't get there just bits and pieces. You kind of have to accept way more militarization of Canadian society in general. And in the UK and in the US, it's things like elementary schools with cadet corps. Like, I don't think Canadian recruiters still speak at BC university campuses, but not just having a recruiter passively at a job fair, but like having an ROTC contingent at your university and all this stuff. Like it's baked in on a societal level, and the net result is people like their military more. What's interesting, if you think about this in a like social trust or institutional trust context, is in all Western democracies, including Canada, we've seen an erosion of trust in almost every institution except the military, which, you know, I guess could be a good thing in my line of work, but is actually really bad, because in the States and in the UK, arguably, it produces a kind of reflexive support the troops or the military is good. It doesn't produce a lot of engagement with the questions that I think are more important to ask about defense policy, like, is this a worthwhile expenditure of blood and treasure? Should we be actually doing this? Is it worth people's lives? Should we be spending this much money on weapons, or while people, you know, don't have enough money for food? Like in the UK, a couple of years ago, they decided to reinvest in their nuclear deterrent, and it's something like 200 billion or 300 billion pounds in a context in which, you know, all of the indicators lately are that more and more children, disabled people are living in poverty or dying of, you know, malnourishment in that same country. So you can't get there without all the bad sides. I think, what can the CAF do? Probably stop having so many bad actors in their bunch, but I don't know what can be done. So there are some amazing programs that they already have. There's one called the Canadian Leaders at Sea, in which politicians and journalists are invited onto warships and into units to see what the military does. But more broadly, we don't have enough people who are informed about defense writing defense stories. And so the bad news happens because there's essentially 3 people in the Canadian press corps who actually write about the military. And one of them has been writing about the military for a long time and has personal grievances, or what, like however you want to describe what's going on. The fundamental problem is, what is the fundamental problem with the Canadian media landscape more generally? There aren't enough people to do it, and there's not enough funding. People aren't willing to pay the money to fund these, and so that the journalism doesn't get done. That's not a problem the CAF can solve. And in some ways, if the CAF are like, here are 35 good news stories about the Canadian Armed Forces, would you like to write about them? I don't know if that's going to help either. There've been some interesting initiatives, like if you live in a small town that has still has kind of a local newspaper, one initiative is to have people from those communities who have joined the CAF go back and talk to their local newspaper about what they've been doing on deployment and that kind of thing. You know, local boy makes good kind of thing. And I think that could be effective, but it's sort of like the chicken and the egg problem. How do you get more people interested in the military? Well, you have a more militarized society, and how do you do that? I don't know. It's a similar question to recruiting and all of that. So there's no easy answer, and I don't know actually how much of it is under the Canadian Armed Forces control and how much it is societal. That might be okay, actually. I think I've sort of landed on probably that's just fine, but there's some room for debate there. Yeah.
All right, well, guess it's on. So as I was coming up to think of this question, I realized that it's maybe not fully related to actually like defense policy or anything like that. It's kind of a question to do with like the spread of information and like the speed, which I don't know if, you know, that's something it's okay to talk about. So if this question is bad, I apologize. But it's kind of related to what you were talking about with like TikTok and the internet. And I will say for the record, I've never downloaded TikTok. I've never used it once because I did not trust the platform and I do not need all that. But I will say I'm also a very huge nerd. And one thing I like a lot is comic books and like superheroes and stuff. And platforms like TikTok, and I think the internet in general, can give a very good creative outlet for people to be able to share those kind of stories and things that maybe like inspire them or just things they enjoy with other people. So I don't really know where I'm going with the question, but to me, it's, and this is again, probably from my perspective, it's kind of undeniable that the internet can have an effect like that of being able to like give people access to like stories and ideas and things that they haven't previously heard of. And I don't know, I guess I just wanted your thoughts on the internet potentially as a tool that could be used to help people like learn more and overcome problems. I don't know if that's.
Yeah. Yeah. So trying to be like, this is Andrea, the defense scientist versus Andrea, the political scientist versus Andrea, the cranky mom. So there are undeniably great things about the internet, which isn't why governments are reluctant to regulate it, to be perfectly honest, but is definitely a concern if you're thinking about regulation, which, as far as I've seen, is the only way of combating that aspect of disinformation, is just to have less information. I think the creativity, individual creativity outlet is an interesting one, because it kind of implies that you need an audience to be creative. And if you think about like needlework, so there used to be this whole genre of needlework that were samplers. Now, this ties into the fact that you couldn't work outside the home if you're a woman, so you're like, well, better learn how to stitch pretty things quickly. But needlework samplers used to be a way of learning how to do letters and figures and things of needlework, but also framing them and kind of showing off your work. And so there has always been a little bit of a performative aspect to arts and handicrafts. But the extent to which everybody now has a platform for displaying and merchandising their quote unquote creativity, I'm not personally convinced that's actually of net benefit. I don't know if it makes the world a more creative and better place. And I don't know if it increases individual introspection or artistic quality or anything. But also, that is not my part ship. So I can have those idle speculative thoughts as a private citizen. The part in which it does interact with my own work is the extent to which we have genuine communities that have been built on the internet, and especially for, let's say, displaced diasporas of people who have come from repressive countries where they've fled here. And so they have little bits of community in countries that are around the world in which cyberspace is how they connect. Those communities are real and they're important, and eliminating them would have a huge impact on people's lives and people who are vulnerable for other reasons. And so that has to be taken seriously. And so to take my own advice about you can't have the one without the other, most of the solutions that we can come up with are essentially a return to a time in which the internet was not this dominating factor in our lives, but it is the dominating factor in our lives. And so those solutions, in the absence of something like peak oil or electromagnetic pulse or World War III, in which we're forced to kind of take a step back into prepper Armageddon heaven, they probably aren't going to work, because the harms that they will create, the unintended consequences, are so great. Which is, again, why I don't sleep a lot at night, because these are policy questions, but are actually like huge existential angst social questions. And if you treat them as a policy question, you miss a lot of nuance. But if you completely absolve any sort of regulation or policy making or government, then you allow the harm to kind of continue unchecked. So yeah, what I've come up with so far is you sit with that tension and you figure out the best thing you could do. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think everybody needs to be able to have a Patreon for their art. And that's no slight on comic books. I mean, kind of self-produced art more generally. But I do think the broader question of the way in which the internet is so integral into the way that we grow and communicate and be as people, that's the part that's really hard to get away from. At the back. At the back, and then blue shirt, and then black jacket. Okay.
Okay, sorry. This is kind of similar to the last question about the internet and social media and whatnot, but like, I was just thinking about how like everybody on like Instagram or TikTok, whatever you have, like you have an algorithm that kind of follows what you're into, like left wing, right wing, and it kind of fuels polarization a lot through politics. And I was just wondering like what you think, like if implementing policies to regulate that or mediate that is better, or if you think we're going to see more of that happening with governments in the future. Yeah.
So I'm going to show my Marxist in an analytical sense colors here, and say that the version we have now in which private companies do the content moderation for us is probably the worst timeline for a variety of reasons, but it seems to be what we have collectively agreed upon, and it's possibly better than nothing, because in about 2 to 5 years, my prediction is that things are going to be so polarized and tense that all corporate speech will be reduced to the most blandly anodyne of neither here nor there as a result of the culture wars, which is probably for the best, the kind of let's just be institutionally neutral, which is never neutral, but let's pretend for a while that it is. But in the meantime, it is making us all angry. And so I used to talk a little bit about polarization and how that affected the Canadian Armed Forces and the way in which some people's partisan politics were making it worse for the CAF. And I kind of stopped because I have a duty as a public servant to be perceived as neutral. Like, I don't want anybody to go away from this talk and be like, that lady is definitely checking my email for wrong speak. And the reality is that the research has shown that susceptibility to disinformation, desire to share misinformation, consumption of known disinformation, it's not equitably distributed across the political spectrum. And so if you're going to have measures that purport to clamp down on disinformation, and especially like media outlets that disseminate disinformation, it is going to have a partisan slant by default. And that is really dangerous as a government to do. So like, I can tell you all the facts about which news outlets consistently repeat disinformation and are the sources themselves of disinformation and are shared reliably by certain segments of the Canadian population. But it's not a policy solution, because policy solutions require political buy-in from Canadians. And when a solution only affects one portion of the population, even if the science shows you why, it's not effective as a solution. So do I think that our internet should be throttled and unthrottled at the whims of robot boy, what's his name? Meta, Zuckerberg? No, I don't. You know, my slide that's like, who's in charge of this stuff? It wouldn't be him that I would elect, and it wouldn't be Elon Musk or any of them. But that's what we have. And although currently we're having a little bit of a spat over which side of the political spectrum capitalism currently favors, in the end, I'm fairly confident that the imperatives of making money will win out, and everybody's speech will be suppressed. So, yeah, that's the good version. is that everybody's speech is effectively suppressed under capitalism, and we recover a little bit from the culture wars. But that's not a good solution, except it's better than some of the others, I guess. So, yeah. Sorry to not have a better answer for you. Okay. Blue shirt and then black jacket down here. Yep. I'm so grateful that it's not just me, the old person who cannot figure out the microphones. This is very validating. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I guess my question is, if humans are programmed a certain way to understand information and narratives and stories, is it more productive to educate everyone past this weakness, or would it be more worthwhile and perhaps in the interest of the common good, as cynical as it sounds, to maybe fight fire with fire?
Oh, so basically have like a set of government approved narrative that we inculcate children in kind of from in elementary school. Yeah, so we've done that fairly successfully. There was this, so I don't mean to start any interdisciplinary fighting, but I don't always see eye to eye with historians who study the same things I do, for example. But a historian wrote this amazing book about basically constructing masculinity in Southern Ontario and masculinity in service of war in the lead up to the First and Second World War. And now I cannot remember who wrote it and the book itself. And I feel terrible because I don't know if a lot of people read it. So here's a situation that I could be introducing this book to a bunch of young people, and I'm totally fumbling it. But fantastic book. And it went through all of the ways in which the entire Ontario pedagogical system, from daycare to church groups to Boy Scouts to elementary school to parents, everything was designed to create a whole bunch of adolescent boys who were super keen to die for their country. And it actually requires a fair amount of effort. So you have, the Boys' Own annuals and the Kim Just So stories and all of these stories that make it seem glorious to die for the empire. And then you have that message as part of your advertising. You have it as part of your gender socialization for men and for women, so that women are equally excited to bear sons to give them to the empire. You have a program of building monuments in your town to the war dead. So the Boer War, which was a largely unimportant conflict, people started building a ton of these memorial sculptures to them as a way of getting men to be eager to serve in following conflicts. So it totally can be done, but it requires, to get back to Putnam, it requires a lot of social capital and a lot of time and buy-in. So you could do that in Southern Ontario in the early 1900s, because the total cultural diversity in Southern Ontario in the early 1900s was like, ooh, you're of Welsh descent? I'm of English descent. That's sexy and foreign. So it's a lot easier to do that when you have a coherent and cohesive ethnocultural background, which we don't really have in Canada. So the downside is lots of communities are doing that themselves, but their narratives are mostly about their own groups. And it's not contributing to a coherent whole. And that's if we collectively decided that having a coherent set of narratives that we collectively socialized our children into was a good thing, which that's a separate question. But let's set that aside and say, yeah, we totally want to do that. Who's writing those narratives, and who's the star of those narratives? Because one of the things that narratives almost always have are a hero and a bad guy. So you're in a group here, pretty representative group of people from the Lower Mainland. You write me a narrative in which you all agree to inculcate your future children into, in which there is a coherent good guy and a coherent bad guy, and a story in which the hero gets the girl. And and then convince your girlfriends to buy into it as well, and your boyfriends and your poly partners and whatever else is going on in your life. I don't think it can be done anymore, even if we wanted to, and I don't think we want to. It can be done in other places. Gets us back to the militarizing your whole society question, but yeah. Okay, black jacket, yes.
So in the slide where you were comparing technological evolution to how our brains work, this one.
Yeah.
You finished the slide by saying that our institutions are failing and that they're failing because they were built for a system that doesn't exist anymore by people that are trying to hold on to a system that doesn't exist, if I have that right.
Sort of, yeah.
And two of the things that you said was they're holding on to notions of national unity and free speech as outdated principles. And I would just love for you to expand on what you mean by that and what you would say would be the prescription for how we have institutions that live in the modern age.
Ooh, that's a good one. So the free speech thing, I mean, I personally think that free speech is fantastic, but I'm clearly part of the problem that I am describing in terms of institutions being built for a different time. So if you've heard the expression like debate or sunlight is the best disinfectant, or debate is how you get, you shouldn't repress any ideas because open debate is how you decide what ideas are good and bad. So, Neil Postman's whole book in the 80s was basically, that used to be true. He was writing in American context. So, 1740, that might have been true when people would get together in their meeting houses in small communities in which people were mostly related to each other or ethnically similar or of a similar regional background. Like, think about how much less travel and immigration and cultural interchange there was. So you get into a room full of 100 people with whom you had a personal relationship with almost everybody, and you could decide on an issue that was important to your community. Like, do we build a new grain barn? Or is this person a witch? Or whatever you were deciding upon. In that sense, and let's ignore all the power dynamics that were existing in that room, because at a certain point you have to just say, I can't count how many things we have to consider anymore. But in that context, you probably could have a free exchange of ideas in which the most persuasive idea won over everybody in the room. And that was a worthwhile way of adjudicating those things. And for a long time, you could actually argue that we had that all the way up to even the international level. So setting aside a whole bunch of things about the League of Nations, for example, the ideas behind it were essentially that educated people who had the same mission in mind, who were generally of good character, and that usually meant were devotees of whatever faith they extolled, but hopefully Christianity, because that's the way it should be, right? Those people could sensibly get together and talk about the issues of the day. And for a while, it worked pretty well. But the caveats have always been that the population that created those representatives was able to be effectively represented, so therefore was relatively homogenous, and that you didn't care too much about the rights of the people whose were being infringed. So we used to have fairly clear-cut ideas of who mattered and who didn't, partly because we had more cultural expectations about individual charity or community and that kind of thing. And a lot of our institutions were built, this is always the big debate about small L liberalism and the free market, like the guiding hand of the free market. How free was that market? And there's a compelling argument that's like, if you go back to look at what Mill had in mind for how the free market works, everybody in the free market has a religious faith that has, a whole bunch of things built into it that moderate the worst aspects of capitalism, like a fundamental belief that gluttony is evil and the need to care for each other. Well, if you strip all of that out of it, which we have done, unfettered capitalism is bad, and it was sort of anticipated to be bad even by Mill. So you can extrapolate by that all of our institutions left a lot of other things unsaid. This came up when Trump was president, and then after the January 6th attacks, expressions, whatever you want to call them, insurrections, people were like, hey, isn't there a rule about this kind of thing? And the answer was like, no, because this sort of person was never supposed to be in power. We left a whole bunch of stuff unsaid because the assumption was that whoever was elected president would be a sensible person who had small c conservative values and an interest in the greater good, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's partly what I mean by institutions are failing, is that they were created in Canada for a Canada that probably did exist a long time ago, but doesn't anymore, and were created by people and perpetuated by people who like were on the debate team and who love that kind of thing, for whom the interchange of ideas has always been an exciting and non-harmful process. It was never, our institutions were not created by people who have permanently never had their voices heard, or for whom, you know, when they speak up, they're attacked. So that's sort of what I mean by our institutions are run by people like me who are nostalgic about a golden era that may or may not ever have existed. Like, I love to debate. This is my jam. I love it. But I come from a position of extreme privilege in the sense that, you know, I'm a fourth generation professional with a long family history of the civil service. I know all the rules of the game. I was literally born to do this. So of course I enjoy it. But that doesn't mean that this is right for every Canadian, or that this is fair for every Canadian, or that even if this is the best solution to anybody's problems. There's a lot of people like me in government and in politics, and that's a problem, because it's really hard to convince people like me that maybe it shouldn't always be the most compelling voice in the room that gets to decide things. Maybe that person is just good at talking, but is actually kind of a terrible person. So, yeah. Model UN is a bad thing. No, I'm teasing. Model UN's got a lot of fun, but it's the classic like villain backstory for political scientists is Model UN. So are there any other questions? Oh, yeah, in the back, and then in the Farrell sweater, and then in the plaid shirt. Oh, do we have to stop?
I think now that you pointed at them, I will, you know,
Okay.
maybe give them 30 seconds each.
Okay.
Ask your question and then you respond.
Okay. Yeah. There, and then the black and white sweater, and then the black and white shirt with the black hoodie. Yep, right in front of you, the woman right to your right. There, yeah. Okay.
Right. Thank you. Just a quick one. I think there's no denying that political ideologies, they play a fundamental role in shaping our perspectives, right? So what advice will you give to Canadians who may be conservative or liberal, but their political ideology shapes their perspective towards the military, right? So what advice will you give to them to join the military, irrespective of whatever ideology they have?
Oh, I would never actually advise anybody to join the military. Not because I wouldn't, not because I would advise not to join the military, but because the only thing I would advise you to do as Canadians is to learn more about the military and then make up your own decision. So my partner is also in the military, and we have 2 kids who are 16 and 18, and people ask me all the time, like, oh, are you going to get them to join the military? I'm like, they both want to be doctors, so maybe, because the military will pay for it, but like, I was pretty intent on not raising them to want to join the military by default. And that would be, in terms of getting Canadians to put aside their ideological blinders about the military, it's actually how you feel about the military is actually kind of like a fundamental small L or liberal and small c conservative orientation. So it's almost impossible for people to put aside their ideological lenses because they're really inherent in us a lot. So again, my only advice would be to learn more about the military. And ironically, this is actually advice I used to give my military students, which is make friends with a civilian. Because the way that a lot of, especially officers in the military, become officers in the military is by joining the military at like 17 or 18 and then spending most of their time with military people, including for a lot of women marrying people in the military. So I did sort of jokingly suggest, but really mean it, that like having a buddy from the civilian world is a good idea. So yeah, if you know somebody in the military, talk to them. But I'm not here to recruit you, except for the science side of things, which is cool and you should totally join. So. Okay, black and white sweater and then black and white plaid shirt, and then Dr. Kufa is going to make me stop talking.
Okay, you were talking a lot about the investing social capital into your community. Do you think that there's any worth in investing that social capital in the internet, or is it just too polarized to have any worth in that?
I think it's a totally worthwhile investment. I just don't know if it's a thing that exists. So the thing about social capital is that it's social in the real world, I guess. So it goes beyond networking. Like LinkedIn is kind of a way of trying to fake social capital in the internet in some ways. It produces some of that networking effect. But social capital is produced mostly in totally mundane and everyday instances of personal contact. And so, well, most of you will have done like online schooling and stuff during the pandemic, and now you're here in person. So you know exactly as well as I do that there's some very cool things that you could do on the internet to promote intimacy and community and that kind of thing. And I'm not talking about feet pics, although I guess that's one example. It's not the same. And you know, in my workplace, we're having this big debate about return to office and hybrid work versus in person. And there are pros and cons for both. And there's a huge number of power dynamics at play in the return to office and that kind of thing. But the reality is, for a lot of people in a lot of ways, face-to-face contact is important. And I don't think that can be replicated on the internet. But I do think it is a worthwhile investment to make the internet a more harmonious and possibly safer place for people to interact. I just am not convinced it actually builds social capital. Okay, plaid shirt. Can you pass the microphone to the guy to your right or left there? Yep, just in front of you. Oh, it's back there. Okay, it's coming. No pressure, but you're the last question, so everybody's going to be counting on you to make it really good.
Okay, so one, thank you for the talk. It was amazing. So my question is, you mentioned how your institutions are failing. What do institutions like the CAF, the CSIS, what do they currently do to combat information, and like why are they failing at that?
I can't tell you anything about what CSIS is doing because I don't know. And as to what Canadian Armed Forces is doing, not totally sure how much I'm allowed to tell you about this stuff, but I do have colleagues who are working closely with parts of the military to have these sort of discussions with their members to get them to think about how they are information actors. I myself have made suggestions to CAF leadership about some things that can be done to reduce the amount of information-related polarization. So, for example, don't talk about politics at work. Don't allow politics to be talked about at work. And this includes things like don't let members use slang nicknames for political leaders, but also don't have a TV playing in your office space. So in the US has had a real problem with radicalization in its military members. And the January 6th issue in particular came up because Fox News plays in a lot of break rooms and hallways and stuff in US military installations around the world. So touch wood, our information environment is not, our media environment is not quite as insanely polarized as it is in the US, although we're getting there. So that suggestion is more proactive. I'm not particularly concerned of like, oh my God, global TV is showing at this basis or anything. It's just more of like, get used to having to adopt institutional neutrality in terms of what the Canadian Armed Forces is doing in the information domain more generally. I'm not really going to speak to that beyond what my own research is, but the Canadian Forces is made up of people just like the rest of Canada is, maybe not as hugely representative, and they have a few ideological demographic things that make them differently vulnerable, but they face the same challenges that this room full of people do, only with more men. So yeah. So I don't mean to sound like mysterious and secret about stuff. It's just, you may be guessing that I've been pushing the boundaries of what I'm allowed to talk about more generally, mostly because the rules are written for my colleagues who are real scientists. And so when they give us guidelines about like, oh, make sure that everything you talk about is backed up with empirical evidence, I'm like, I'm a political scientist. So most of this is going to be me giving you my opinion. So yeah, but I can tell you're a historian by how much you're laughing at my political scientist jokes. So.
All right. Oh, thank you so very much, Andrea, for such an interesting and very informative, talk. At this point, I would like to invite Dr. Sylvie to provide some closing remarks and.
Well, I will. I don't have anything prepared, but I want to thank you for this very engaging talk, for this generous talk. You kept you
oh wow
past your dinner time. Thank you to the Department of National Defense, Public Relations for sharing your expertise, to being here with our students, and gave us a lot to think about. And we talked about, you shared with us about distrust, and that's really a large part of what we experience every day. You also told us about the importance of social networking and community, and it's great to experience that together, as well as this good critical making sense of the information around you and using your own ethical compass to navigate this world in which we live. So thank you for your thoughts, and thank you to the Political Science Department for bringing guests, and to our students, your students, for joining today. And we have a small present to as a token of
Thank you very much.
appreciation. Thank you so much.
You guys are a great audience.
So that concludes today's Politalk. Please, we have some refreshments for you outside. So don't be in a rush to go home, grab a bite, and we hope to see you again at the next Politalk. Thank you very much for coming.
Do you want to stop the recording? So is it Control?
Alt.